if we do have time, you're still welcome to come up to the stands and ask any additional questions that you may have. Thank you.
Okay, we have some questions here, and one of them has to do with recalcitrant students. So, what is one way to get around the possibility of students not responding or producing or participating in the oral activity, the discussion of the content, because they are at the beginning level and have only a passive knowledge of the vocabulary from the content-focused practice?
Yeah, so that's a hard one for me to answer, because so much of the work that we've done in immersion is with students who have a certain level of proficiency and they just love to participate, as you saw at least in one of the videos. So I'm not actually sure that the practice part of this, pushing students to produce language, we know that it's important from research. We know it's important in the immersion context. That was where the output hypothesis came from, Meryl Swain's work. And so with beginner learners, I have a tendency to like the work of Bill Van Patten, or people working more on the idea of receptive practice. It's important to know that not all practice is production practice. There's receptive practice. So it seems to me if learners aren't participating because of a lack of proficiency, you need to redesign the activity so that it's more about, more related to processing instruction, or more based on comprehension. There's all sorts of interesting games and practice activities that can be more comprehension based. So that would be one of my answers to that. It's easier if the person's actually, I know who asked that, because then I can dialogue with that person.
Any follow-up from the person who asked that?
Hold on, I'll bring you the microphone.
That question was purely in self-interest because I'm going to be teaching beginning Spanish next year, and I want to know how to, because this looks really interesting for implementation, and I'm, I guess, worried because a lot of people who come into introductory classes don't really have a lot of background, so but yeah, definitely I like the idea of the comprehension based activities.
Thank you.
Thank you. Several of these questions seem to relate to translating your ideas into different contexts. So this question asks, can you imagine a way to do a similar project with students from different language backgrounds? So I'm assuming different L1s in the same classroom.
So I think that's in reference to the study where we use storybooks in the two different languages. So yes, I mean, that actually can be done in any kind of context, and I think it's very interesting in any kind of context. There is some work in Canada, I think that Jim Cummins has done some of it, and right now I can't remember the name of the person from the University of Calgary that uses in multicultural, I'm not sure if that's but this is referring to sort of multicultural and multilingual classrooms, the use of storybooks in children's other languages. So it's very feasible and very validating for them. So that's my understanding of that question. If in that particular context they're still learning there are two languages of instruction, let's say it's Spanish and English or French and English, then you can still do this this kind of study regardless of what that student's home language is. You can focus in on the instructional languages of the school. But yeah, it can be done in any kind of context. And I know of other contexts in which it's been done.
Any follow-up from the audience on that?
I'm just thinking of the types of multi-level readers in content court, and I think it was National Geographic or one or the other, had a series of content-based social studies and maybe other themes, and then they would have concepts from that field, but then they would be developed at different levels, but in different levels of difficulty, but all the students would be reading the same content, but they would be having different level readers. The readers would be designed, say the concept about hibernation, say, and they would have several different sets of materials, and they would all be talking about hibernation, but they would have, maybe each have different animals, but they would still be at a different levels for that. And they could each contribute based on their level of being able to read. And do you understand?
Yeah,
what I'm trying-
that sounds very nice. I mean,
Yeah.
that's a nice way to approach differentiation in the classroom.
Yeah, right.
It's really, so it's different from the read aloud projects that we did.
So that would take care of the issue of so many different backgrounds, language backgrounds.
Oh, I see what you mean.
It might also
Mhm.
help out in that area. I don't know.
Thank you.
So here's another one. Do you think integrating language and content is important for adult learners? And if so, what content should we use?
Well, my answer is yes. I've become an advocate of content-based language teaching. It seems like an interesting direction to go. I think that in my own personal experience, I used to think that content-based instruction wasn't necessarily the way to go for beginner learners, but not everybody agrees with me about that. And there's a new book out by Laurent Camerata. I can't remember who the publisher is, but it's all about Routledge, and it's about integrating content-based instruction into foreign language classrooms. And I find the book very interesting. The whole idea is let's turn foreign language classrooms into sites of discussion and sites of critical thinking, and let's get away from just learning about the weather. And let's discuss issues. And so I think that in that sense, content-based teaching can be so much more motivating than some of the things that are happening right now. In terms of the strategies, I mean, you'd have to ask Laurent Camerata what those strategies are, because, you know, I actually don't know how to approach content-based language teaching with beginners, but Heidi does.
I would even rephrase the question in the sense of why are we even asking whether adult learners should be focusing on content? I would turn the whole matter around and say the typical quote-unquote language instruction at the college level, and I will elaborate on that tomorrow, is close to insulting as far as content is concerned, unless one rethinks the entire enterprise from the beginning and says the whole idea here is to find a way of linking content and language learning right from the beginning. In the beginning, sort of in response to your comment, it's probably not going to look appreciably different than well-done communicative language teaching, except that it will pitch the point that you made earlier, though probably not quite in Bill Van Patten's version, but find materials that will provide enough of the kinds of modeling that of course will be more comprehension-based, but with the intention of then turning it around and saying, here is the way they express these kinds of meanings. I am giving you the linguistic resources for that. Let's see whether we can start transforming it, and then finding, as you know, what we've done, we've essentially sequenced it by different genre, and it is eminently doable from the beginning to the end. And just like you said, for your students and your teachers, I would say the same thing for the teachers in our program and for the students. It's a revelation that, yes, this is actually very doable. Not only is it doable, it's actually enjoyable.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yay!
And I'm just going to
Can I just
re-ask.
follow up? Oh, sorry.
I was just going to ask just one more time. So, but what content should be used? I mean, it seems in the classes that you talked about, it's very clear. You know, it's a social studies class. But if you just have a foreign language class or an ESL class, what content do you use?
So, I mean, you can, I'll just say that in Laurent Camerata's book, he talks a lot about social justice issues. And that's why I say, like, using the foreign language class as a site for discussion and critical thinking. And I just want to give an example. It's actually a chapter in that book. With one of my graduate students, Joy Morgan, we did a study integrating content into a foreign language class, foreign language classes here in the state of New York. So it was upstate New York. So foreign language, they were 10th and 11th grade, and it was French as a foreign language. And she wanted to turn the counterbalance idea around and see what it was like integrating content into a language-focused class. And she designed a remarkable unit on the environment and did it very critically. I always say she should have gotten her MA in environmental sciences instead of second language education. It was a really powerful unit. And this was implemented over several weeks in this French as a foreign language classroom. And there was a lot of blood, sweat, and tears because it was very frustrating. At the beginning, students didn't really understand. It was frustrating for the teacher. And by the end, like, she was quite persistent. By the end, the students were so satisfied and so fulfilled that they had actually done all of that in French. So anyway, that's an example of environmental studies or social justice issues. Heidi, did you want to add something?
We probably do it slightly differently in the sense of the whole program has to find a way of essentially teaching German-speaking countries' culture. So we then initially start out with very contemporary things of life, and then move relatively quickly into various historical aspects. There's an entire course that takes the period from 1945 to now. That reminded me very much of what you were doing with timelines, because we're getting into absolutely everything from narrative tenses and foregrounding and backgrounding is all textually oriented, where everything that is the grammar that we do need to teach, obviously, is directly taken from the texts. And we only focus on those things that are most salient in order to make sure that over the entire course, all of those issues are actually taught in a content environment where they are as salient as we can possibly make them, and the texts are selected like that. And so timelines, retrospective, prospective, rethinking, you are now at this point of the narrative, what happened before, what will happen thereafter, can we speculate about all of those things will be happening. And then of course you get your syntactic complexity out of that, and then once you start moving from the narrations to the issues, then you're starting to move towards advanced levels of ability.
That's what I was going to say.
Yeah.
Okay, another question here is, what are your thoughts on using the L1 to analyze an article or paragraph with beginning students in order to highlight grammatical structures and turn the analysis into an intellectual activity?
Again, I just don't have the, I feel many of these questions are coming they're about adult learners that are starting foreign language instruction at the university level maybe, and I have no experience. I know that's common here. Many other countries start their foreign language education quite young. L1, I mean, that's such a huge issue, the use of L1, and if it's with beginners, I'm sure it can be very useful. And the point was to turn it into an intellectual activity. It seems, I would have nothing against that. I'm not sure if the person who wrote that is setting me up. But it seems to make sense, but I really don't know how to approach beginner levels right now. You do, you could answer that.
No, I don't think so. Any follow-up on that? I'm just moderator. Any follow-up on that? No? Yep.
it's not a question, and I also don't have an answer to how we approach content-based instruction in adult language classrooms. And I hope it's not too obvious that it's self-promoting my own study, but I actually have some backup evidence to support content-based instruction. The study that I presented this morning actually showed a difference in terms of adult second language learners' sensitivity to grammatical knowledge, which was the English article system in this case, and their sensitivity was gone. The sensitivity that they had that was shown in a study, in a separate study where they were tested on the English article system, was gone when world knowledge that they had, for example, the relationship between doctors and stethoscopes, or a scientist and microscopes, when those knowledge was thrown in an online study, their sensitivity to the English article system or misused English articles was gone. So I think there's a point in using content-based instruction in adult language classrooms too. We just don't know how to do it.
No, I'm sorry, I need to clarify. So in your study you found that the content-based instruction actually had a negative impact on
No. What I'm saying is, because in the content-based instruction, it seems that you're not teaching contents that students are already familiar with, right? But that is, I think, that is a problem. But you are talking about social studies. If the students already know everything about the social studies, you're not probably using them to teach language. And what we mean by content-based instruction is probably you're integrating the two, right? New knowledge about the world and new grammatical information too. So then I think my study supports content-based instruction in a sense that students are or become more sensitive to grammatical features of a second language when they're not immersed in information that they're already familiar with.
Okay. I just want to follow up because now I thought of the answer to the other question about how to address, how to engage in content-based instruction with beginners, because it's true that with advanced learners, you try not to replicate content, so you're always trying to present new content and not something that you know they already know. But in certain CLIL, or classrooms that are being experimented with in contexts like Japan, I do recommend that teachers, EFL teachers, seek out what the content is in the rest of the curriculum in Japanese and bring in some of that content into the English classroom. I think that is an interesting way to use content with beginners. But I realize that I'm answering the previous question and not your comment, but thank you for your comment. But it does raise a question. I just want to raise this question about this idea, like, because I don't think we really know this answer, so this is an interesting research avenue to explore. I talk about a lot about content and language integration, and some of the studies that we've done have tended to measure language development, but not necessarily the content gains. And so we don't really know the extent to which a focus on language, that there might be competition between language and competition if we have a dual focus. And what we really have to do in our intervention studies is make sure that we are measuring both language development and conceptual knowledge. It's very hard to do. I mean, that's what I really wanted to do in one of those studies I talked about that didn't.
Question over here.
No, I wasn't sure whether an elephant in the room is there's English for academic purposes and English for specific purposes that are fields that would be answering this question, right? About what to do with adults and content.
Well, I don't know if my comment is that, I was just wondering, we could look to English for academic purposes and English for specific purposes that deal with adults, and that's certainly with content, right?
But not necessarily beginners, right? So if they're doing English for academic purposes, isn't it because they're studying maybe high level course already in English? But it's interesting that you raised, I mean, English for academic purposes definitely needs to be part of the discussion about content and language integration. My experience in China, for example, is that when I come and talk about content-based language teaching, they understand English for academic purposes. That's what they say, yeah, we already do that. But it's a bit different.
We are out of questions up here, but we have a couple of hands raised. So if you want to come maybe to the microphone now, or maybe the microphone can come to you. Okay.
Thank you very much. So I have a couple of questions. First of all, I want to say that I really appreciate Roy's counterbalancing hypothesis, because that is, it makes a lot of sense, and it is also a reminder to people who do studies on form-focused instruction to first find out what's needed and where the strength lies, rather than applying form-focused instruction just, blindly. Because in some cases, you really need to supplement the content as opposed to the language part. Then I have a question regarding what goes into that form-focused instruction, because in your integrated approach, you have form-focused instruction and then corrective feedback. And the example you gave today involved use of textual enhancement, right? So related to that, another question that I had was, how do you actually make that decision on what language to focus on? Because you spoke about a proactive choice of form. So was that done in a bottom-up way, in the sense that you first settle on the content, and then see what really stands out in terms of language? Or do you actually start with some language form in mind or construction in mind, and you look for materials?
Yeah, that's a very good question, and it's an important question for teachers, and in fact, it's the question they always ask. How do we proceed, and how do we identify the linguistic targets, and how do we know it really fits in with the content? So, the way we've proceeded, first of all, in the context that I've been doing this research in, there is a great deal of research that has been done since the 70s on the interlanguage development of French immersion students, thanks to the work of people like Birgit Harling and her colleagues. And so we actually know a lot about the interlanguage development and what their problems are in terms of verb tenses, grammatical gender, morphology, and so on. So I draw a lot on that work, and I try to introduce that to teachers so they become more familiar with those problems, and they say, oh, gee, I thought it was only my students that had that problem. I'm so happy to know that research is documenting this. And the problem is that the marriage between language and content sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. So I was very happy to do this project with social studies teachers, because many of them chose to work on past tenses, not just it's not the simple past, not just the passé composé, but the imperfective tense and so on. The grammatical gender one is a completely different issue. I have many teachers working on grammatical gender because I consider it to be one of the greatest challenges of a second language learner of French, and probably other Romance languages. And the thing about grammatical gender is that it doesn't have any meaning, so it's very hard to incorporate it into a meaningful way. So most of us are just attacking it the way that I showed you. So you could have an historical text, or a teacher I've recently worked with did it in mathematics, and really just targeted words and used highlighting to target words that follow the pattern, to try to get the students to detect the pattern. And that's where this model comes in, where you kind of have to tune out a little bit and zoom in on the language and then come back, because it doesn't fit. The tenses I have some wonderful examples of how so in Romance languages, you usually have the perfective and imperfective tenses. And there are really interesting ways to look at history through those verb tenses in a way that really help you to understand what the actual events are and what's in the background. And so you can do a really interesting historical analysis thanks to a linguistic analysis. So these verb tenses lend themselves to that. So to answer your question, it's a bit of both. And in terms of identifying it, I start with an interlanguage analysis. And so that's how my book actually is organized according to language problems.
That makes a lot of sense. So regarding the corrective feedback part, I know you have been really, you feel very strongly about using prompts versus like a reactive, the recast, for example. One thing you said earlier was that prompts would actually sort of allow learners to sort of reveal what they don't know, right? That's what you said earlier about prompts. So you prompt them, so they have to use the language, and in doing so, they reveal what they don't know. It's a way to sort of engage learners. So my question is, once they expose to you as the instructor what they don't know, would you then resort to recast or what?
Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a whole. What I tried to say maybe didn't come across very clearly, but I really think that there's a purpose. That there's a need for a variety of feedback types. And a recent study I did with Kezio Saito and Reginald Gooch, which was with Korean learners of English, and it was focusing in on pronunciation. And I think it's one of maybe the first studies that actually compared the effects of prompts versus recasts on pronunciation errors. And there were some slight benefits for prompts, but what really became clear that an ideal sequence is simply you start with a prompt. If it doesn't work, then you recast. It's as simple as that.
Again, that makes a lot of sense because you start with what learners do know or don't know. It's a way sort of to gauge their readiness, and then you sort of respond to it accordingly. Yeah. Right. Thank you.
There was and then there's another question in the back. So, sorry.
Thank you. This is more about a question on the perception of languages, the attitudes that you saw from the children. Did they have a preference on one language over the other? If they did, how did the teachers handle this, given that Canada is a bilingual officially country? If they didn't, how did you attain that? I mean, we strive here in the States, trying not to create a racial discourse behind language teaching and language perception. And it's something that Canada at least suffers less from my understanding and experience. So what was the perception of languages in the classroom?
Well, the work that I did with young children, I think when I talked about that, the fact that when the home language is English and you are encouraging learners, I'll start over. First of all, with the young learners that I worked with, there really wasn't a strong preference for one language over the other. It's something that we've noticed as children get older, so that when they reach adolescence, they start to have preferences, they develop a social language, and it might be their home language. The reason I was keen in this research to allow children to draw on both of their languages, but to do it in separate contexts, was simply to counteract the discourse on translanguaging, which many teachers have interpreted as meaning that you allow students to use both languages and use the language that is most comfortable for them. And that works in some contexts, especially if the home language of that child isn't being acknowledged at the school, right? I couldn't agree more with people like Jim Cummins saying that you want to acknowledge children's home languages. when the home language is a majority language like English, I think that the equation changes. And I don't think translanguaging applies in the same way. And I think you do have to create different contexts for the languages. And while trying to help students to make connections, as we did in that study, so that they're making connections across the languages to improve their biliteracy, but they also know that for the sake of practice, in one area they're practicing one language, and in the other area they're practicing another language.
So if I may, to paraphrase, what you mean is to kind of creating a space to validate that other language, or?
Well, I've been talking about schools that have bilingual education programs, so that there are two instructional languages. So it could be Spanish and English, or it could be Korean and English, or it could be French and English. And in those contexts, not everyone agrees with me, but I think it's important to create separate spaces. But I also know that there are many contexts that have been reported on here in the United States where it's just very different because of the social context and the extent of the use of the home language and so on. I've just written, well, I have a paper that's under review that I've written with some colleagues, including Fred Genesee, looking at translanguaging and just trying to make the point that it's context specific, and we can't generalize about L1 use across the board, because it depends what that L1 is and what the context is.
Thank you, I couldn't agree more. Thank you.
I think we have time for just one more question or comment right here, if you want.
This is just a comment about choosing adult content, and a lot of the intensive English language programs have developed content-based themes or theme-based parts or whole courses, English through news or English through stock market or whatever. And I think what becomes really important is that the students, if it's possible, to get them to tell you what themes they want to talk about as adults. And as you talked about, there were some social justice issues. If there are things going on in the news around, you could come in with a menu of topics or themes, and then have the adults choose them, the ones that they would prefer to, rather than us. We can come in with somewhere we're prepared to talk about, but let them choose, and then we can go back and find the material, and also go to their content specialty teachers and get content that they want to have reinforced. You had suggested to some extent that.
Yeah,
but I
thank
think
you for that.
It's been done a lot, but I think.
It's good to say, yeah, thank you for that.
Okay, I think that brings us to the end of the roundtable. So let's all thank Dr. Roy Lyster again for
And let us thank Sean.
Thank you, Dr. Lowen and Dr. Lyster. So